Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I think this season so far has had fewer sort of built-in halachic topics. This is actually a great one to have rabbis representing all the major streams of Judaism at, because when we were thinking about, actually, and this one was Rabbi Schatz's idea about for topics, there's this scene where Amir is interviewing for the Sochnut, for the Jewish agency to go to Venezuela, and they give him a number of hypothetical scenarios. Now, what's interesting being a small town rabbi is the ways in which the questions and situations that arise in the small town rabbinate are so utterly foreign to people who are in big places. And just like these things don't arise. And so it's sort of interesting seeing how Amir responds when there's questions about like, oh, this person who's getting intermarried and wants you to, they're going to get married in the church and they want you to come to the wedding. Like, what would you do? Or like, oh, you're the rabbi in, I forget the name of what city it is, but there's a tribe of Indians who wants to convert and they want to know what you're going to say to the Ministry of Absorption and so forth. Like these kinds of things, which are like, to me, like sort of normal, not normal, but like things that would happen in New Orleans, that would not necessarily happen in like Manhattan or Brooklyn, or probably Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So, right, I think.
Yeah, I was just wondering why you didn't name the obvious city involved.
I don't know if you're a small town or a big city. I've never been there. It's not true. I was there once for a wedding.
You should just continue. Okay.
So.
Are you one of those people that thinks there's no Jewish life west of the Mississippi?
No, he's just one of those people who doesn't want to ever come to Los Angeles.
I've been there once. I was there for a wedding. It happened to be my sister's wedding. That was the only time, though. So, no, I'm aware of the existence of Jewish life west of the Mississippi. I think, are we west of the Mississippi?
Josh, just continue with the class.
Anyway.
Yes, you are west of the Mississippi.
Thank you.
You're just digging a bigger hole. Just continue with the topic.
So we thought that could be an interesting conversation talking about this, when Amir gets this question about, a tribe of Indians who wants to convert and make Aliyah and so forth. And like, what would you tell them? And he is like, Indians? Like is what he says, just sort of looking at conversion and thinking like sort of rewinding history to the kind of origins of conversion and thinking about as it plays out differently in different denominations today, sort of what pieces of sort of original conversion, quote unquote, we hold on to and what we have dropped along the way. If that makes sense. So a little bit earlier in the pre-episode class, we looked at a couple different Talmudic sugyot, or sections of the Talmud that discuss conversion. And I mean, I think there's a few things that come up. One that's just sort of interesting historically is that often people would come as groups to convert. And that was sort of more common. I'm like in touch regularly with a friend in Ghana, where I was studied abroad, who's the head of the Jewish community there, and their whole community converted, all of them together. Is one group. And like that was just sort of like a thing that, okay, we as a community want to convert. This comes up a lot in South America. You have like large groups of people who just kind of want to convert all together. And the conservative movement actually tends to be much nicer about that, right? Like the community in Ghana converted through the conservative movement.
Yeah, like, it was 100 years ago.
No, less than that. It was like 30 years ago.
There's another community in Africa.
Uganda did that.
Ghana, but Uganda converted 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, Uganda. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's the Abu Udaya.
I was there right before the pandemic.
Really?
Not right before. It was January of 2019. And I did a lot of international travel in 2019. Little did I know that in 2020 I wouldn't be able to do any. But I was at the Jewish community in Uganda with Gershom Suzomu, Rabbi Suzomu, and his community. And there was something to me jarring about davening the service I knew in a room full of Black people. And it was interesting in terms of my reaction. The secret racist. But I really valued the experience there. I just heard a TED Talk today about the importance of travel in creating an open mind. And Uganda was certainly eye-opening in every possible way.
Yeah, it's right. So the Abu Udaya community in Uganda goes back, like you said, about 100 years and is sort of an established community. But then there are others. So like, for example, I studied abroad in Ghana, which is in West Africa, not East Africa, like Uganda. But the rabbi of the community was this guy, Alex, who I talk to all the time. He went to Uganda to get training as a rabbi because there's sort of the big community over there in Uganda, and his community in Ghana is much smaller. There's a documentary, I think it's either on Amazon Prime or Netflix, all about the Jewish community in Ghana. I forget. I think it's on Prime. Anyway, and Alex is kind of featured in it. He's a great guy.
Had he already converted when you were in Ghana?
Yeah, his father was the head of the community. His father was the one who sort of led the community down this pathway.
The organization Kulanu, and you can look that up, sponsors and financially supports emerging Jewish communities in all sorts of unusual places.
Yes. So, right. So Kulanu is sort of the major organization that helps with this. And then it's interesting to think about the connection with the question that's raised in this episode, because a lot of the same questions that anyone from any of these communities in Africa or South America are going to have in trying to go to Israel, where they're not going to be recognized, right? It's like it's sort of this challenge where you have people who en masse are accepting Judaism, and for different reasons. So I'll give the example of the community in Ghana. I think it was, again, Alex's father who was sort of the leader of this community, and he said the community had always observed their Sabbath on Saturday, and they had slaughtering practices which were similar to kashrut, and they didn't do work on the Sabbath by punishment of death, and it was like all this stuff. And then they got a Bible and were like, oh, look, this is the Old Testament is what we do. The New Testament's not what we do. We must be Old Testament people. We must be Israelites. And they didn't know that Jews elsewhere in the world existed until they got radio and heard about this country Israel in the 70s. And they're like, there's a country of Jews. What is this? And so made their way to the embassy and are sort of found, as it were. And it's kind of this interesting question about who then recognizes such conversions as valid. And also the question, I think, of the suspicions with which such groups and conversions are seen. So I know this came up a couple of years ago, that there's a community, I think in Colombia, if I remember correctly, that sort of did a mass conversion, but they all wanted to make Aliyah. And the Israeli government was just no, I don't care who converted you. No, you just want to come here because you want to leave Colombia and move to a better country and get automatic citizenship. And we're not taking you, and this became a whole thing, which I don't think they were ever allowed to come, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, Rabbi Schatz, were you going to
I was just going to bring it back to the topic that from the episode that one of the things that I found so interesting, both about this and the intermarriage piece in the interview, was that they were clearly looking for a specific kind of answer, right? So that when I said to Rabbi Pernick, we should talk about this, and don't tell anybody, but we don't actually disagree about that many things. And when we do disagree, don't make that face. When we do disagree, it's not necessarily based on like a value system, but more so based on the denomination that we are part of and how we, therefore, in this case, convert students differently. Do you disagree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
yeah.
So I think that there is something to be said for. I think there's something to be said for, and you're right. It's lovely that your dad's here because then we also have the Reform movement voice. It would be interesting for us to discuss what the process of conversion is for us, and if Amir had been a conservative candidate, that what his answer would have been. If he had been a Reform candidate, what his answer would have been. And actually, I think that he's probably even a little bit more traditional than the response that you would potentially give from the modern Orthodox movement. So specifically because he's in Israel and it's all very different, as Rabbi Pernick was just saying, in Israel and in terms of movements in general, Israel is very different than America. So is it okay if we take it in that direction?
Sure.
I'm asking you because you and I teach the class together. Is that okay with you? Okay.
Sure.
So do you want to go first? Do you want me to go?
Well, Renee has her hand up. So
Renee has her hand up.
I just was wondering if you can give me a quick synopsis of what the episode was about, because I didn't get to watch it and I'm kind of confused just hearing this conversation.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead. You're good at synopsis. So
the episode touched on a few different themes, but the theme that, or the storyline that we're touching on was that Amir is trying to find a new job and he runs into an old friend who just got back from a 3-year shlichut in Toronto through the Jewish Agency. And he is like, you should do it, not necessarily to Toronto, but you should do like a shlichut with the Jewish Agency. It's great, and you get to live abroad and so forth, whatever. And so Amir, together with Ifat, apply an interview for a shlichut mission, and it ends up that it would be to Venezuela. And as part of the interview, they're sort of trying to see if you would be a good fit for like a shaliach in such kinds of communities. And so they ask questions of like things that will come up, so for example, you'll have someone, so like the guy who's interviewing pretends he's a woman and says, hi, I'm whatever my name is. And she reaches out his hand.
It's a role play.
A role play. There's a lot of role plays. And so he shakes his hand. And so he's like, oh, you would shake a woman's hand? And, like there's all these kinds of things to see how would he be representing the Jewish Agency and Israel more broadly in this role. So that's kind of where it touches on.
So we were going to talk about shaking hands, but then I reminded Rabbi Pernick that we've done that already.
Probably.
And then we decided that maybe we would talk about these pieces because part of the role plays that come up are then in terms of like the people who they might be around and the situations that they might come to Amir for as like the Jewish leader in that community. Does that make sense, Renee? Okay.
So by the way, I'll just note one thing. So there's a popular halachic work, modern halachic work called B'marei HaBazak. And it's basically all tshuvot written in response to questions from people like on things like shlichut to Venezuela.
Wow.
And each question, it says where the question is coming from. Shaliach in Taipei, or in Venezuela, or so forth, and there will be questions that are then responded to, and there's like volumes that are sort of arranged according to different sections of the Shulchan Aruch, but it's all like questions from out in the world, and it's from like people in situations like this who are like Israelis who've gone to wherever far-flung place, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this question. So
that's so interesting.
Yeah,
I've never heard of that. Okay, well, do you want to go first in terms of talking about, your dad unmuted. Maybe he
just unmuted because I actually sent something to Rabbi Schatz, which I meant to include for the group, but I was saying that was kind of like the response to literature, which every movement has, which is based on exactly that, situations that come up in a community and the leaders really aren't sure exactly how to handle it. So they would seek out a sage, whether it was the Rambam or, maybe in the case of our different movements, we have a response committee. What do we do in the case of such and such?
Right. I mean, and what's fun about B'Maria Bazak, it's all in Hebrew. I don't think they ever translated it, but it's sort of like so many questions in Shuvot are like kind of obscure, in the weeds kinds of things that are being discussed like in the Beit Midrash, as it were. And what's nice at these is like they're all real life questions from real life people out in the world. And so they touch on things that are maybe also obscure, but like obscure in a more real way. Like, because they're things that actually happen. Like Maseh Shahaya, it's like a thing that actually happened. So it does kind of make it more fun.
Okay, why don't you go first, talk about how you do conversions, and then I'll go and then we'll have your dad go.
Okay.
Why are you laughing?
But I think the question, right, the challenge is that for every person, it's sort of, the process is different. There's no sort of standardized universal, like this is what it looks like. Generally speaking, and we saw this when we looked at the Talmud a little bit earlier, there's sort of three components for a male of a conversion, and one is obviously absent for females that are, it's Mila, Tevila, so circumcision, immersion, and Kabbalat ol mitzvot, acceptance of the yoke of the commandments. So those are sort of the big three. Back in the day, it was also sacrifice, but we don't do that anymore. So those are kind of the big three in terms of like the things that were, a person needs to have done in order to become Jewish, is immerse in a mikveh, circumcision if they're male, and acceptance of the yoke of the commandments.
And can I just clarify?
Yeah.
That circumcision does not mean if you are already circumcised, being circumcised again, because you can't do that.
It means time.
What it means, I was going to say that. I know.
Okay.
What it means.
I don't know what your movement believes in,
Josh, what it means is that if you are already circumcised, that you would have what's called hatafat dam brit. And that is that a tiny bit of blood just needs to be, not removed. What's the word? Well, they use like a little lancet, but to show that there's a little bit of blood. Michael, you want to tell me what word?
Extracted.
Extracted, sure. From a circumcised penis, right? So that there's still, that the man is circumcised, but there still is that element of blood of covenant that needs to be taken to mean Mila, which is what Rabbi Pernick just mentioned. Okay, continue.
I'll just note, by the way, that sometimes, right, at least in the Orthodox world, if there's a child born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, that when they do the they might have a moil for the bris, who would do a bris l'shem Mila, l'shem gior, sorry. Which basically is it's sort of a different document that they write out, which essentially says like, I am doing this circumcision for the sake of conversion. It doesn't mean that the child is now Jewish, but it means that if later on they were to go through the process of conversion, they wouldn't need a hatafat dam because I'm doing this bris to sort of function as that one of the three. You mentioned the three things you need. They haven't done the other two yet, but this circumcision would function in that way later on.
That's often done for children who are adopted into Jewish families, because then they would be taken to mikveh not before 8 days, but typically we'll take babies to the mikveh anywhere between 30 days and a year, and then if they're a little bit older. So that is one useful way for that. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. I've interrupted.
So again, one thing that came up when we were looking earlier at sources, and I think that it's sort of an interesting idea from the Talmud. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment so you can see this. This is from Yevamot. Right, so it says the sages taught in a Braita with regard to someone who came and said, I am a convert. One might have thought that we should accept them. Therefore, it says, if a convert sojourns with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The emphasis is on with you, suggests that only someone who was already presumed by you, it says to be a valid convert, but I think either to be a valid convert or to be Jewish should be accepted as a convert. And I think this might be some sort of like this idea that we very much play out practically of, a person needs to sort of be integrated into the community in order to be converted, right? Someone who's living far away from the Jewish community and doesn't really have any interaction with any Jewish community, even if they've accepted full Torah observance and full everything, halachic observance, and all of that stuff is fine, but they're not part of the community. They're not familiar with the terminology. They're not, right? They don't have any of those pieces to where if they went into a Jewish community, they wouldn't be able to pass, as it were, because they haven't been, like, no one knows them. They're not part of this, like, wouldn't be accepted as a convert, almost in any case that I'm aware of. There's sort of that piece as well, which is, okay, there's the acceptance of the commandments, or at least the yoke of the commandments. There's Milah and Tefillah, but there's also that piece of, and this is where it becomes complicated, because we say that piece of fitting in, but then of course there's people who don't fit in because they don't quote unquote look the part, whether that's for like the racial reasons that we were talking about before, or other reasons that someone doesn't quote unquote look the part, and it can be sort of unfairly exclusionary. But there is something about trying to become integrated into the community and sort of being seen as part of the community beforehand as sort of part of that conversion process. Padre.
But I don't think this ger is considered to be like a convert, is it? The one that's spoken of in Leviticus.
It depends on how you read Leviticus, if it's a sojourner or a convert. But they typically the rabbis read it as convert.
They read it as, because what about, like Gerim Hayitim Be'eretz Mitzrayim? I mean,
I know. The shot reading of the verse is not convert, but the way it's typically read by the rabbis is as convert, which, by the way, has ramifications then when it says about not oppressing the stranger. It's like, no, you can't. It's about not oppressing the convert. You can be mean to a stranger, but you can't be mean to a convert, right? So there's sort of limitations in applicability of those texts that are sort of not ideal, that come from it being limited in the rabbinic minds, a convert.
Well, it doesn't seem like Rabbi Hertz, at least, agrees with that. But this Rabbi Hertz.
That's the Chumash that we use. Again, that's the straightforward reading of the verse. Yeah. But in the Talmudic mind, it means convert.
Okay.
Well, also the Talmudic, not necessarily mind, but moment, right? They want to read it that way because that's the way that they're putting together their statement. So they're reading into it, not an unfair way of reading it, but they're reading into it what they want to read into it to get the product that they want.
Right, which is that you have to be nice to someone who converts, but you don't need to be nice to the other people who are just sort of living in the land around you. Only people who've decided that they want to tie their fate to the Jewish people. That's right.
I mean, I'm not going to say that's right, but you said that correctly. Yeah. Okay. So I'll share a little bit about the conservative movement. So based on Amir's moment in that interview, if anybody were to say to a conservative, really Jew, but in his case, leader of a community, whether rabbi or not, and they said, this person of any kind of culture or any kind of faith wants to convert to Judaism, his answer would have been, great, well, I'll be happy to meet with them. We take on the same things that Rabbi Pernick mentioned before. We do Mila or Hatafat Dam Brit. Thank you very much. We also do take everyone to mikvah, obviously. The third piece of taking on the mitzvot, we would say we do. However, that definition is very different in the conservative movement and in the Reform movement than to the Orthodox movement. So when I teach my Intro to Judaism class, I very often, there's in the curriculum that we use, there's a chapter on denominations, which I mean, just being in a class with Rabbi Pernick and me, you can see that there is confusion beyond belief in terms of what does it mean to be a part of this denomination versus this denomination? How do you understand things? The lines are blurry at times. So to teach a class on denominations is difficult to do. And I often bring in someone from each of those denominations. So I brought in 2 LA rabbis for this LA based class. One is Rabbanit Alyssa, who works at B'nai David Judea. And the other is Rabbi Alex Kress, who was working at UCLA Hillel. So we had a panel that talked about the different ways that the different movements engage with different pieces of Judaism. And one of the questions was conversion. And one of the things that Rabbanit Alyssa said was, we take a much longer time than the other movements do because we want to make sure that the people who are converting into our denomination are practicing a life within the context of the modern Orthodox movement, which means becoming fully Shomer Shabbat, which means becoming fully kosher, which means learning the laws of Nidah, all of those different things that are seen as this idea of ol mitzvot, of taking on the yoke of the mitzvot in the modern Orthodox movement. They want, as Rabbanit Alyssa said, they want completion in those areas. Whereas what I would say is, I want to see my conversion student on the journey to completion. I don't need someone to stand in front of me at a Beit Din and say, I've kept kosher for the past 6 years and I'm ready to do this. And one of the things that Rabbanit Alyssa and I discussed a lot in that panel is that, and she said this, I didn't, though I believe this also about my own movement, that when you expect that of people going into the modern Orthodox movement, what you're basically saying is you might be more observant than many of the people who go to our modern Orthodox shul. But they're going to our more modern Orthodox shul without any questions asked because they were born this way and they can just walk in and decide, well, I go to modern Orthodox shul, but I don't actually keep Shabbat. So we realize in taking students through these steps that we're asking something that we don't even ask of our own blood, right? We don't ask of our own born Jews that when they get to bar mitzvah, for example, we don't say, what are the mitzvot you know that you're going to be taking on fully? And that, I think, is where the conservative movement breaks away from orthodoxy to say that we know that there are different levels of taking on mitzvot. And so we don't want someone to come to us and say, I've done all of this. I'm at the top of the keeping and the guarding, the shamor and the zachor of all of these different pieces. But rather, I've tried keeping kosher. These are the steps I've taken so far. I've tried keeping Shabbat. These are the steps that I would like to see me taking on in the future with my family. And that for us is a beautiful conversation that then leads to mikvah. So I would say that there are many differences in terms of the actual process and the actual learning, but that is one very stark difference between the conservative movement and the Orthodox movement in terms of when you are actually ready for conversion.
Yeah, I would just add, I think in Orthodoxy, there isn't necessarily an expectation that people are going to be perfect in their observance of everything, because no one is perfect in their observance of everything, or almost nobody. But there sort of needs to be a person needs to be in a place where they viably can do all of these things. So even if they're not necessarily 100% going to do everything perfectly, it needs to be a viable possibility. And they're at a place where they have done that and they've tried that and they're trying, there's sort of things are in place. I think there's sort of more of a sense of like that word ol, or like burden, on the rabbi as well, of like, okay, if I'm putting my name on someone, then anytime that they break these laws, that's like on me. And so I sort of need to know that the payoff is going to be ultimately the scale is going to be in the favor of merit, because it's sort of it's the same, similar, almost like when someone gives smicha, they give rabbinic ordination. It's sort of like, I'm attaching my name to you. So if you don't follow through, or then it sort of weighs on my ultimate scale, as it were.
Karen, and then we'll let your dad share.
I run support groups of people converting to Judaism through the AJU, American Jewish University.
And they love you.
And I love you, and I love them, and I love Greenwald. I love everybody. Anyway, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, of course.
What we talk about is not yet. So at the Beit Din, if do you keep kosher? Well, not yet, but I don't now have meat sauce with Parmesan. There is a sense of a journey, and you're not there yet, but you're open to all. Just thought I'd put my 2 cents in.
No, that's a beautiful way of framing what I was sharing. And I think that a lot of what you hear from conversion students is, well, this is how I keep kosher right now. What if they ask me X, Y, and Z? And I always say, you should be honest, because it's better that you be honest than you say, well, today I didn't eat that, right? So it's better for the person, I think, right? I've never been a smoker. I've never smoked a thing in my life, but from what I understand of smoking is that it's hard to go cold turkey. But if you do something to allow you to wean yourself off of whatever kind of smoking you're doing, it's easier to then stop the habit. I think it's the same with acquiring habits, that if you decide I'm going to stop doing this completely and then say, I'm just going to be kosher tomorrow, well, that's going to be much harder than if you go through the journey of keeping kashrut or of keeping Shabbat and very slowly tack things on, so that at some point you do, as Karen just said, you're able to say, well, not yet, but this is where I'm getting to.
Rebecca? So I just want to make one comment on Karen. Okay. I just wanted to make one comment on Karen's point, which is actually sort of in line with, not exactly in line, but there's an idea in the Talmud. So there's an idea in the Talmud that you can't convert someone who says, I'm willing to accept everything chutz midavar echad, right? I'm willing to accept everything other than one thing, right? That person you can't convert. But the idea of the chutz midavar echad is if someone says, I accept the legitimacy of 612 mitzvot, one of them I am absolutely not going to do, then you can't convert that person. I think Karen's point about the not yet is sort of right, that point of I'm open to all of it. I might not be there yet with all of them, but I'm open to all of them. Whereas the chutz midavar echad is a person who says I'm there for 612, but one I am absolutely not going to do. Like that's a person you can't convert because there's not an openness to that one mitzvah. So I think that's an important point that you raised. Okay. Rebecca and Leonard.
Does the Beit Din turn the person down twice, and do they give a reason and tell them to work on something so when they come back, perhaps they're enhanced observance?
So the way that it works in our movement, though I kind of assume it's the same in the other movements, is that the person looking to convert chooses a rabbi. In our case, they actually have to go through a class first, and then they start speaking to a rabbi as their sponsoring rabbi. And then I spend anywhere from 6 months to a year to maybe even more with that person, learning just the two of us one-on-one. I've never said to a person, come back. I have said this is going to take more time than you think. So it's kind of like the modern day version of go away, come back, go away, come back. But I don't know of anybody who does the 3 times thing any longer. I think there are versions of it in modern day where a person might think, oh, we're going to come to you. You're the rabbi. You're going to hear that I want to be Jewish. You're going to sign this paper, and then I'm going to be ready to go to the mikvah. I've never done that. And if someone asks me to do that, I say you should find somebody else. Because I, as Rabbi Pernick said, you are going to carry with you my name on a certificate that I thought that you were ready to be Jewish. And I want to make sure that I have that connection with you in a very legitimate way. So no, and I think there are ways to make it still valid in the world, that it's not just a shoe-in experience, that you still have to prove that this is something you really want and that you're going after.
Okay, Yuri.
I just want to say, I feel like it's really hard, as a convert, when you're coming into this, they tell you about all these different streams, but sometimes you don't really fit into one particular stream. And, you know, and I feel like because of your gender or just whatever, you may have to settle for a less observant stream, even though you're more observant, because because you want that equal role. But then you also struggle with acceptance because now this whole other part, the part that you most identify with, doesn't accept you at all. And they never will, because you were just born the wrong gender. And, you know, and what, for me, when I converted into the conservative movement, I was very pregnant with my second child, and when my baby was like 10 months old, we had to go to Atlanta. I live in New Orleans, and I remember that feeling of like, oh, you know, this is finally it. Like I'm going to be accepted into this community. But having to leave New Orleans to go to the mikveh in Atlanta was the very opposite feeling of acceptance. I was very aware of how different, I still was to like something I felt so connected to. And I feel like as a convert, like you have like this asterisk. Like, yeah, sure, like inside you feel like 100% Jewish, but to the outside world, you're just this asterisk Jew. Like, oh yeah, okay, like you've converted, but you're not really us. And I feel like, you know, there's so many more steps that you have to take if you're a parent to make sure that your child doesn't face these struggles. And it's not your soul. It's not like how you feel. It's not like how you're practicing. It's just you're doing it for them, not for yourself. It gets to that point. And I feel like it's just so hard, you know? Because, I mean, at what generation in my children's, like, life will they just, like, not, like, be looked at as that, as a convert? It's kind of like an emotional thing to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak to the New Orleans piece at all. But I think, first of all, you just said many things, many that were beautiful and many that were also heartbreaking. And I think that one of the things that we try to do, and it sounds like we need to get better at it, but one of the things that we try to do is make sure that anybody who chooses to be part of Judaism recognizes that you just weren't part of Judaism to begin with, but now you've found where you're supposed to be, and that you shouldn't feel like you have an asterisk, and you should never feel like there's some kind of otherness. And so I'm sorry that you felt that way or you feel that way. And the piece about the children, I think that's really important, that I was just actually speaking to a conversion student about this earlier today, is that there are many ways in which how you convert, with whom you convert, where you convert can be a hindrance to your children based on the path that they choose. And I think that it's also very important for the person converting, and it sounds like you did this very intentionally, to choose where is most comfortable for them to also be Jewish. So I obviously, I can't speak to your community nor to the process of it, but I would hope that you can also recognize that part of that conversion piece, even though there are children in the picture, that conversion piece is so much also about you finding your place. And the only other thing that I wanted to add to that is that even being born Jewish, I think we often don't know what denomination we fit into, right? I have this conversation with Rabbi Pernick all the time. There are many aspects of different denominations that exist in this world that I wish that I could take parts of and say, well, I like that piece and I like this piece, but I couldn't necessarily be a female rabbi in all of those different locations. So I have no like bow to put on any of those comments, but those are my comments.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, because I think this is a question. Whenever I talk to people looking to convert, it's sort of like that desire to have it sort of things be universally recognized is like so not impossible, but so almost impossible to sort of achieve, because okay, so you can convert conservative, but then you wouldn't count an Armenian in Orthodox synagogue. And you can convert Orthodox, but if you wanted, or your kids wanted to move to Israel, there's no guarantee that the Rabbanut would accept them as Jewish, So there's,
And by the way, you probably would count an Armenian and an Orthodox Minyan because no one's asking you at the door, did you convert or are you born Jewish? So,
right. So there's,
so again, like pieces. A lot of those pieces I think are given to conversion students by the rabbis to let them know kind of all the things that possibly, if this or that, those stars align, could potentially be difficult. But ultimately, I don't think that if someone walked into a shul just as a person, that they would be asked, were you born Jewish or did you convert?
Right. No, that's true. But I think other pieces about, gender and mitzvot and those kinds of things are just like, other things that you talk about all the time of like.
Totally. Yeah. I think they're very difficult even for someone who grew up in a Jewish home. I think the gender piece is always going to be difficult. Unfortunately, when it comes to religion and where it comes to you fitting in and wanting to make sure that you can, be the person that you want to be, but also in the denomination of Judaism that you feel fits you. That's really hard. Karen, and then Rabbi Pernick can give us the Reform Digest.
I just wanted to add that, and I didn't hear really where you were talking about, and it may not matter, but so much of it has to do with the nature of the congregation that you're trying to join. I was born Jewish and that was it. I feel as though I'm a convert. I'm an adult learner, an adult practicer, jumped right in, volunteered, etc. And it really has to do with the warmth of the place, and no one is allowed to ask you, I thought, whether you're a convert or not. I thought that's like, whoa, a big non-mitzvah thing to do. Yeah. And so it really depends on that, I think. And of course, in LA, you have tons of places. A very dear friend's son happened to be wherever he was working for Rosh Hashanah, goes to a synagogue, and not one person said hello. When people come to my synagogue, if from the UJ, I say, tell them you want to see Karen, and I'll tell them that I'm here and where to come. And then I introduce you to everybody in the world, and you want me to stop talking to you. Okay? So it depends. And I'm sorry you have a problem with any of it.
Amen.
Well, actually, all of the rabbis here in New Orleans are fantastic, and the community too. It's just, you can absolutely tell the difference, like between, like if you don't, convert through the Orthodox movement, like you definitely are just not probably going to be accepted by anyone more observant than the conservative movement.
I would not be accepted as even when I go to the grocery store, I'm worried that I'm not wearing a skirt. But I see lots of other people wearing pants, women. So that's the deal with that. Okay, never mind.
Would you like to go? Rabbi Dan Pernick?
Dad.
So I just also want to add that I was very moved by what Yuri had to say. And I would just want to add that a lot of times Jews are the worst teachers of Judaism because, people, and we have those people in the Reform movement, and they're in the conservative and the Orthodox and renewal and whatever you have. Some people feel that if you don't grow up eating gefilte fish and matzo ball soup, that, how could you possibly be a Jew? And I think you need to be secure in your own identity, with God, with Torah, with the Jewish people, and to understand that along the way, you're just going to find people, who think they know, but they really don't. And you just need to know that, you are secure and you are, kosher in your own right. In terms of that, just kind of going back to what we were talking about, with conversion, it reminded me a lot of the Hanukkah menorah and the debate between Shammai and Hillel. Shammai said you start with all the candles lit, and Hillel said in matters of holiness, you always want to be increasing. And I think they said pretty much the same thing with regard to conversion. Shammai said, basically you have to be living by Kabbalat mitzvot. You have to be living with the yoke of the mitzvot. And Hillel basically said, you teach them the basics and they're going to grow into it. And every rabbi is going to have a different perspective in terms of how to do it. And that's why some of us might have issues with the way other rabbis do it. There are Orthodox rabbis who do, and this has been very well publicized, very quickie conversions for large sums of money. And there are, Reform and conservative rabbis, as well as Orthodox, who will take years before converting somebody. Well, I guess what I can tell you, the Reform movement does not have standards like you must do this and you must do that. But I can tell you that I would think that the large majority of Reform rabbis requires or at least very strongly encourages mikveh. It will vary by the part of the country one is in. In terms of hatafat dam, the symbolic circumcision, I certainly recommend it. I have been present for 3 adult circumcisions. Those were over 35 years ago, and they brought a stretcher for me in the hospital where they were doing it. It was quite an experience. But there is something, this is one of the 2 mitzvot, which are described as a symbol of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. So, it is a really big deal. We require, obviously, a serious period of Torah study and learning with the rabbi. Just like Rabbi Schatz said, we have an introduction to Judaism course. It's usually 15 or 16 weeks. The movement teaches it. I've taught it many, many times. And then there are the individual meetings with the rabbi. But, it's kind of like kashrut supervision. I used to think, before I had 2 Orthodox kids, that, kosher was kosher. You have kosher cheese, it's kosher cheese. And all of a sudden I learned that, Sarah's not going to eat this kosher cheese. It's like, well, it's tablet K. I mean, what's wrong with it? It's like, no, you can't do that. And Hebrew National. And it's really very similar when it comes to conversion. Some people are going to say, well, who converted you? And, some people are going to look for the defects and some people are going to look for the beauty. So, there's diversity in the Reform movement in terms of that. But I think as a movement, we've certainly moved far more to the traditional side. But I'm guessing, and Rabbi Schatz is obviously going to know, and actually maybe Josh does as well, the Northeast is a very, very traditional part of the country, I think, for all 3 movements. In terms of the Reform movement, I mean, almost every Reform temple has 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. There are yarmulkes and talitot in all the Reform temples. I mean, not everybody wears them, but they're certainly there. We do a lot of very traditional things, but I don't know, in the South and maybe in the West, what I am told is that it's much less traditional from a ritual perspective.
Yeah.
So I think so.
Yeah. I just want to say one last thing, and then and that was when I was in junior high school a few years ago, and we had to read the book Yes, I Can, which, anybody know it? I see Robert nodding his head. It's the autobiography of Sammy Davis Jr. And he literally went to the rabbi who kept turning him down, and he thought it was a racial thing, and then he finally learned, what the story was. But I agree. We take people in, and I will usually let them know about that history. And there certainly have been issues with we call them Jews by choice, and that relates to what Karen said, in the sense that we're all Jews by choice. Even if you're a Jew by birth, there are plenty of Jews by birth who that's their only connection. So,
I was just going to use the Jews by choice line. My dad says that all the time because he believes that every Jew is, that we should be seen similar to what I said before about like keeping our conversion students to a certain standard. He says, we're all Jews by choice. You wake up every morning and you decide, are you a Jew today? Or are you not a Jew today? And that's based in action, and that's based in ritual, and that's based in custom. And yeah, I agree. We call our conversion students Jews by choice, but I think that's exactly right, that we are actually all Jews by choice, and we just have to figure out what it means, where we are in that journey versus where someone who's just beginning that journey is going to end up.
Could I just ask one question, though, and it's of either of the other rabbis? So there is, of course, the tradition that you're not supposed to remind a Jew by choice of their previous non-Jewish background, right? But why on the ketubah, the traditional ketubah, does it say giurta for, a Jew by choice who is getting married? Because to me, that's like I've never understood that.
A big neon sign.
Mm-hmm.
I can take that. There's different, the amounts of money that are promised are different for divorcees, right, widows and converts. And so now these kinds of questions come up all the time. And like what my Rosh Hashiva Rav Linzer would say is sometimes what matters is what's written and not what's said. And so sometimes like they'll say, typically the word is betulta for a, previously unmarried Jewish woman. And if it doesn't say betulta, everyone notices and it's like, oh, and sometimes other people don't know that background. And so sometimes he'll say, whatever, say betulta under the ketubah, but just have it written something else and just know when you're reading that it's like a kriyuk ktiv, like where kriyuk ktiv is like a thing in the Torah where it's written one way but you say something else. It's the same kind of thing. It's like it doesn't matter what you say if you're reading it under the ketubah. So you're right. It should be written correctly in terms of what's a person's status. But if you're reading the ketubah aloud, you can read whatever you want.
But the answer to the question, which is why, is because of the amounts.
The amount,
which you originally said. Yeah. There is a ketubah that my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohen, wrote based on the halachic sources for ketubah as well as the Talmudic discussion around ketubah. Did I send this to you?
Is this the one you sent me a few years ago?
No, not you. I was asking your dad.
I don't think so.
You don't get to discuss this ketubah right now.
I had a lot to say about it when I first read it, though.
No. And it's a beautifully written egalitarian ketubah. And one of the things that it doesn't have in it is status. So for anybody who's looking at this ketubah for the first time, you'll notice that there isn't any space for betulta or for giurta or panyata is one of the other ones that you can use in the conservative movement. And when I knew someone who was filling it out for the first time for actually her own wedding, and she said, I don't see where I put betulta. And she called, she was someone who I went to school with, and so she called our teacher and said, where do I put it? And he said, did I ask you if you were a virgin? And she said, well, no, but don't I have to put that in there because doesn't it matter in terms of like the actual ketubah price? And he said, did I ask? I've never asked you before what your sexual relationship status is. So I think that one of the pieces that he was getting at in that kind of, Rabbi Cohen way of his was that it doesn't matter. Your status does not matter except for the monetary piece. So if the monetary piece isn't in the ketubah, which it is obviously in a traditional ketubah, it doesn't matter. And your status is then just you as a human with your name. So I'm also not answering the question of why is the money, but I just wanted to add my anger around having any of those names or status put in before your name. So I think it's a way of doing exactly the opposite of what we're supposed to do, which is remind someone of their status of being a convert in that particular case. Norm and Rachel.
I had a question because of the concept of all of us being a Jew by choice. Does that mean that I can wake up one morning and decide, today I'm not going to be Jewish, go out and have scallops for lunch, and then the following day go back?
I mean, there are lots of people who don't keep kosher in Judaism. So yes. I mean, I think that what you're getting at is exactly what religion is really all about. It's ascribing yourself to a way of life and to a type of spirituality and a canon. And if you wake up one day and you decide to eat scallops for lunch, I don't think that makes you not Jewish. I think that just you're making a decision whether or not you are going to keep kashrut. But as we all know, kashrut isn't the only thing that defines you as a Jew. So, when I talk to B'nai Mitzvah students, I say to them, what makes you a bar mitzvah? And they always say, if I read my maftir. No, that's not what makes you a bar mitzvah. What makes you a bar mitzvah is on the day of your 12th or your 13th birthday that you don't wake up and go decide that you're going to go worship in a mosque or worship in a church, right? That you continue to practice your Jewish life in your Jewish home. We just make a celebration out of it. So I think the idea of being a Jew by choice is that you continue to act Jewishly, whatever that means for you. And that could mean eating scallops for lunch, right? It doesn't mean that you can't be Jewish because you don't keep kosher. But being able to say, this is my Jewish identity and this is my Jewish existence without choosing to get rid of that. Rabbi Pernick would have a different answer, but I stole the question.
I have a lot of different answers, but it's different. That's,
a lot of different answers. The name of our next series. Any other thoughts, questions around conversion or anything? Yeah, Michael.
I have a question. We talked a little bit about this at the very beginning. When you're done shaking your head.
I was shaking my head. There's a running commentary that Rabbi Pernick has going in the chat.
I assume so, Rabbi.
Yeah.
And
basically,
whenever I disagree, rather than interrupting, I just, note my...
Type it to me instead, yeah.
I should, after all this time, I should know better.
It's like middle school note, whatever.
I've seen you two interact long enough, I should know. In any event, when we were studying on the New Orleans lesson beforehand, we talked about in the Mishnah, there's language to the effect that when a convert comes, you explain you should be aware of all the problems that the Jews face, etc. And I want to bring that into a contemporary context. When all of you do a conversion, whether it's Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, at some point fairly on, do you have the students read a book or two on contemporary anti-Semitism so they realize what they're getting into?
I don't on contemporary anti-Semitism. I feel like they are getting enough, depending on where you're living, I guess maybe not, but the streets of LA, you're getting that right now. So I feel like they're getting enough of that from the news in terms of the anti-Semitic piece. I do have them read different books on Israel from different angles on the state of Israel. I ask them to listen to Israeli news or maybe read Israeli news and watch Israeli TV. I do ask them to do some of their own learning around the Holocaust, not just World War II. So I can only speak for myself, but a big part of not scaring them off by any means, but I say the same thing to couples when they're getting married, right? You're coming into a family and now you own the other person's story as much as you own your own identity. So when your kids come to you and they say, can you tell me about grandma and grandpa? If that's, your spouse's parents, that you as the other person can still share that story because you own that family's history too now. So that, I think it's the same for conversion students, that you have to be able to, when you enter into this religion, that you need to know that you might be called upon to fight for, speak up for, comment on aspects that are the not so beautiful parts, that are the more challenging parts. Either Pernick have something to share?
Well, I would just add that I don't necessarily have them read a book, but we definitely talk about it.
Yeah. Rebecca and Leonard, I guess Josh is.
I was going to mention when we were at a synagogue in Manila, Philippines, and there seemed to be, so we went for Shabbat, and in terms of number of men, I was upstairs, Leonard was downstairs. It seemed like there was maybe barely a minyan of men. And Leonard, in talking with the rabbi, he made some sort of comment, and the rabbi said, oh, not everybody's had their bar mitzvah. which was his euphemism for saying that some of them are studying to be converted. Yeah. Not all of them had yet. Mm-hmm. Some of them are like mixed marriages. And so I wondered whether that was something that when somebody converts, are they also at the same time, shortly thereafter, encouraged a man or a woman, if they're over age 13, to have an aliyah to the Torah and be considered a bar bat mitzvah? Is that kind of coincident with the conversion?
Right, Pernick, would you like to say? I'm happy to answer this, but do you want to?
Why don't you go first and I'll comment afterwards?
Looks like I'm taking up a lot of space. Yeah, so we will say to a person, if they're comfortable coming up for an aliyah, definitely to take one. We'll give them a mishaberach. We will not necessarily use the language of bar bat mitzvah, but definitely allow them to feel like they're coming up to the Torah for that moment. I'm going to answer something. You didn't say this, but this is the direction I thought you were going in, which is, what do you do when a kid comes to you from a family that hasn't necessarily grown up in a community for a bar bat mitzvah, and you don't know their conversion status? Maybe they were adopted, or maybe you don't know the conversion status of the parents and you don't really want to ask. So one of the communities here in LA, Ikar, does a really beautiful thing where part of their 7th grade religious school, they actually, maybe it's 6th grade, they actually all take all of the kids. A kid who could have been raised in an Orthodox environment and like clearly is Jewish, that kid, as well as the other kid who you might be questioning, every single child goes to the mikveh as part of the ritual before their bar bat mitzvah. As a way of just not even having to have the conversation, but being able to say, anyone who is approaching the Torah in our community, we, the Ikar rabbis, can say that we have seen them, that they have come out and into this world as Jews ready for bar bat mitzvah. So I just wanted to add that. That wasn't your question, but I hope I answered your question before.
So we were listening to the podcast. We weren't able to attend the last session, but we listened to the podcast just before this thing started here. And I was wondering if we ever got the answer to what are the Arba Brachot. Arba Brachot. Norm's
not here anymore, but yeah, we'll ask him. That's a great question. We did. Oh, but maybe, Dan, do you know in the Reform world, I guess at times there have been only 4 of the 7 of the Sheva Brachot recited based on, Norm seemed to think it was based on Israel connection. Do you know anything about that?
I know there is a shorter version.
Okay.
But I don't think it was 4, but I know that there is a shorter version. I don't use it, but there is a shorter version.
Yeah.
I think it eliminates the sos tasis and sameach tesamach.
Yeah. When I looked in the rabbi's manual last week, those were the ones that I assumed were eliminated, but I couldn't take out 3. I can only take out 2, so I didn't know what the other one was.
I would just say, I think it seems, so the bar mitzvah thing to that question, I'm not aware of any Orthodox synagogue that does that. But it seems like a thing that, Reform and conservative synagogues will offer, if, someone has gone through the conversion process and they want to sort of, demonstrate. Getting called up for an aliyah certainly is a big thing, but then some people want sort of a ceremony of, afterwards of sort of demonstrating that. So I've never seen that in an Orthodox context, but I definitely have, people who are here, who are learning with, different rabbis in the community for conversion, that's a thing that's been offered. I know. So definitely is popular.
Wearing a talis for the first time. I know a lot of my male conversion students love the first Shabbat that they're able to come and wear a talit and feel like it's now their garment as opposed to something that they watched other people wear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not so much tefillin, which I can understand, but talit is an easy one to put on. Denise.
So, just kind of bringing it back to the show a little bit.
Yeah.
When Amir was in the interview and they told him, there's a bunch of Venezuelan Indians who want to convert, and he goes, Indianim? But he didn't actually answer. Correct. And I kind of felt like he was sort of trying to buy some time and that maybe he wasn't going to take such a hard line. And it was kind of a nice surprise that he had that level of flexibility, that he didn't just run screaming.
Oh, it's interesting. I think it was sort of the opposite. It was like, to me, it was almost like he was Indians who want to become Jewish, like, because, in Israel particularly, there is that racial dimension that, like, you just sort of don't, you see Thai workers and Pakistanis and whatever, and they're sort of like, they're not Jews. They're like notably not Jews in Israeli society. So this idea of Indians who want to be Jews is like, Indians? They want to be Jewish? Like, like it's sort of, that's how I read it. Because I think that's, like,
yeah, you're totally right. I didn't know that about Israeli society. So.
I mean, I think it's similar in America, that to go back to, I think it was Rachel who brought up, davening in Africa and being in a room where she was singing the same things, but in a room of people that were very different color than the room that she's used to at Temple Beth Am, predominantly. That I think that there is something very unfortunate about if someone comes to you, especially from a different race, and comes to you and says, I want to convert to Judaism, that at least, I'll only speak for myself, though I think that other rabbis have felt this way too, you must be doing it for a spouse or for someone you're dating, or why are you coming to this religion from a different race or ethnicity? And I think it's unfair, right? I think that's an unfair stereotype, because obviously someone of any ethnicity could just choose a different religion and feel very, very at home in Judaism. But I think what you're pointing out, and what you and Rabbi Pernick are thinking about here together in kind of opposite ways, is it's possible that he just didn't even think that someone from a different ethnicity would be interested if it was just to convert, as opposed to part of like a familial or tribal experience. So looking at my old rabbi's manual, there were 4 versions of a marriage ceremony. Well, 3
this is the rabbi's manual that's like more Scotch tape than book. But the 4th one is I could read them to you, but it's a combination.
Okay.
So it is 4, but it's kind of an abridged version of the 7.
Interesting.
So I've never used that, but it is in there.
Very interesting. Okay, well, it is 7:30, which is longer than we typically go, but this is a really lovely conversation. And I'm sure will continue to be many other individual conversations in our individual communities.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.